Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Ask Australians living in our major cities what keeps them awake at night, and many will say house prices. If you're not a young person trying to get into the market, you might be the parent of one or a retiree worried that the value of your major asset could fall if the housing bubble bursts. The latest figures out today from the ABS show property prices rising by an average of 7.7% last year alone. At the same time, the Reserve Bank says it's concerned that household debt is still growing at a faster rate than incomes are. In the lead-up to last year's federal election, the Prime Minister slammed the Labor Party's plans to change negative gearing rules to improve housing affordability.
What Labor is proposing is a huge, reckless shock to the market. This is not fine-tuning. This is a big sledgehammer they're taking to the property market.
Now, almost a year on, things have changed. The government has set up an affordable housing task force, and the issue will be central to the meeting of state and federal treasurers later this week. And a range of measures are being promised in the May budget. Everything is on the table.
What I'm focused on as we prepare the budget is to deliver a package of measures that can reduce the pressures on Australian families who are looking to buy a house, who are looking to rent a house, who are looking to have more affordable access to housing in this country.
So, how do we make housing more affordable now and for the next generation of Australians? We've invited a panel to help us work through some of the solutions being put forward. John Hewson is an economist and former federal leader of the Liberal Party, now a professor at ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. Rebecca Huntley is one of Australia's leading researchers on social trends, and she's the Director of Research at Essential Media. She's been exploring Australian attitudes to housing for more than a decade. In our Canberra studio, we have Stephen Koukoulas. He's the Managing Director of Market Economics and was an advisor to Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister. And Danny Addison is the Victorian CEO of the Urban Development Institute of Australia. She joins us from Melbourne. Welcome to you all.
Good evening.
John Hewson, what stands out to you very briefly about the state of the housing market right now?
Well, I think it's a crisis. It is a bubble. I know people are hesitant in saying that's a bubble. House prices have gone up 250% since the middle 90s in real terms. Household debts are more than 200% of disposable income, 120% of GDP. And it stands as a monument, really, I think, to neglect and drift by both levels of government.
Rebecca Huntley, how do those numbers settle with people on the street when they talk about housing?
Oh, it freaks them out. But, I mean, they may not know the statistics like John does, but they get it. And I think very much that sense that the Australian dream of owning your own house is changing. What people don't know is what's that going to look like, what's going to replace that in the next 20 or 30 years.
Stephen Koukoulas, does that gel with what you're hearing?
To some extent, yes. I think the issue is that we've got a shortage of housing relative to our unrelenting growth in population. So we need to address the supply side. If we're going to be serious about addressing affordability, that we need to simply build more dwellings, and that's going to require effort from both Commonwealth, state and local government sectors. So it's really a supply side question with demand indicators and demand management, and also an important part to play in just cooling off the market as well.
Danny Addison, is that sense of alarm shared by the property industry?
I think it is to a certain extent. I think the worrying factors are, though, when it comes to responding in a more populist way than in a more considered policy way, is that we may actually see some unintended consequences and some perverse outcomes of policies that have been put forward already. And we hope to see really well-considered positions as opposed to just media headlines and one snap grabs.
So on that note, let's start with something many economists agree could have a big impact on reducing property prices. Changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. But is there the political will to remove such popular concessions for investors?
Negative gearing means that you can deduct the costs of your investment against the income in a given year. And in particular, if you've borrowed against that investment, you can deduct your interest costs. And because your interest costs are often higher than the rent, that means that you claim those interest costs as a deduction against your other income, often your wage and salary income. You buy a house for $500,000, you sell it for $600,000, you've made a capital gain of $100,000. But instead of paying tax on that $100,000 at your marginal rate, Instead, you pay tax on it at half your marginal rate. It's the interaction between those two things that makes negative gearing so attractive. Australia's regime for negative gearing and capital gains tax is materially more generous to the taxpayer than pretty much anywhere else. There are very few places that allow you to claim all of the costs of your interest against your wage and salary income, and then do not tax all of your capital gain. About half the benefits of negative gearing go to the top 20% of taxpayers if you look at their income before they claim the deductions. In terms of the benefits of capital gains tax, that's even more concentrated. Over half the benefit goes to less than 10% of taxpayers. It's disproportionately towards older people, not surprisingly. They're the ones who have a lot of assets. They're the ones who are in the investment game. And so this is a tax concession that primarily benefits people between the age of 50 and 65. It means that house prices are a bit higher than they would be otherwise, about 2% higher. So if these concessions went, it would be not brilliant for existing homeowners. Their house prices would be 2% lower than otherwise.
So John Hewson, I want to begin this discussion with you. PwC estimates that abolishing negative gearing would add $5 billion to government coffers. It's a roughly similar estimate for abolishing CGT concessions. What would the political cost be?
Well, I think that whatever the political arguments are, and I mean, both sides are just disagreeing on this issue, but both of them know actually that it will work in the direction of slowing the investor demand for housing, which has been a major reason, I think, that demand has outstripped supply. And in those circumstances, this is something that should be done. In terms of a world where the budget is in deficit and about $100 billion over the budget period, I mean, those sort of savings are significant. And so I think in those circumstances, it makes sense to contemplate doing both negative gearing and capital gains tax, but probably grandfathering them so you phase them in over time.
Stephen Koukoulas, the argument is made that abolishing these CGT concessions and negative gearing would send the housing market plummeting. How likely is that by your measure?
I don't think it's at all likely. I think it's a really important thing to have on the table, and actually negative gearing and the capital gains tax concessions are an important part of this solution to the housing affordability problem. I don't think that we're going to see would see a collapse in house prices because of this simple change alone. There are other factors at play. You only have to witness what's happening to house prices in Perth and Darwin and Karratha, for heaven's sake, to see that prices are falling already in some parts of the country, and that's with the current regime of negative gearing and capital gains tax. I think what we've got to do, and as John pointed out, that it is important that we remove one of the areas of, if you like, artificial demand for housing from the investor base, who are merely doing it to minimise their tax and hoping that they get a capital gain. So if you change those tax rules, you'd certainly remove some of the demand for housing, and you would put downward pressure on prices from those tax changes. How much depends on the other things, interest rates, immigration levels and these sorts of things, when you're working out what the net impact would be.
Danny Addison, who would be affected the most by the abolition of negative gearing or CGT tax concessions?
Well, Jeremy, over 2 million individual Australians own an investment property and negative gear that investment property. 770,000 of those earn $80,000 or less. So we're talking about Australians on average incomes, Australians who are hardworking and see residential property as a vehicle to improve their own situation. So we use words like investors as a collective sort of, I guess, label for this group of purchasers that perhaps in the community we don't necessarily understand and may seem like a threat. But really we're talking about everyday Australians here. And those everyday Australians contribute back to the rental market. And that is a really, really important piece of this puzzle that doesn't really get enough highlighting.
Rebecca Huntley, do you share that view that many of these investors are regular Australians, that they're not the top end of the market, the top end of income earners?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't be able to comment on that. I suppose what's been interesting to me in terms of hearing the community talk about these possible reforms is that while there's general support for them, although a lot of people don't know how they're going to work, there is cynicism that just merely changing some of the tax rules for investors is really going to deal with the problem. It's so chronic that the population is saying, what is the larger pan? I mean, get rid of, wind it back, grandfather it, whatever. Some people don't necessarily understand that. But what are the other solutions? What are you going to do to the rights of people who are always going to rent? What are you going to do to people who are in the bottom end of the rental market? So these are kind of almost like it feels like a bit of tinkering around the edges for people who aren't even in their own home, let alone going to ever afford an investment property in terms of dealing with housing affordability issues.
John Hewson, one of the ideas on the side here has been to allow people to access the superannuation for first home buyers to buy a home. The argument is made that there are already self-managed super funds. The Treasurer appears to have knocked that on the head in the last few days, but does the idea have merit?
Well, just let me say one thing before that, and that is that there's no silver bullet here. I mean, the solution is going to be multifaceted. It's going to include negative gearing, capital gains tax, and a host of other measures on the supply and demand side. Having said that, looking at superannuation, I must admit, as a personal view, I'd like to keep superannuation separate from the housing issue. I can see that some people will argue, however, that if you could access the money early on and invest it, you'll probably do better than you would in terms of investing in your superannuation, which is generally pretty poorly managed in this country. But having said that, I like to keep them separate. I don't think it's much of a solution. The average balances for the first home buyers, potential first home buyers, are very small. They're not going to make much difference. So I don't think I would undo the superannuation system just for the sake of that small benefit.
All right, well, the Treasurer might have ruled out Australians dipping into their super to buy a house for now anyway, but there is one idea to increase the supply of affordable housing Scott Morrison has been taking a close look at, and it's had some success in the UK.
The bond aggregator model allows government to set up a corporation that's function is to allow investors to put their money into the fund and they get a return. The capital that's put in is then used to lend to community housing organisations who can build affordable housing and rent it out to people on low incomes. What we find is that people on really low incomes are being shut out because people on higher incomes are moving towards that lower end stock because it's more affordable. The community housing sector provides long-term tenure for residents, which is really important for people who've had a tenuous link with the rental market. It means that they've got a stable place to live. It means that they can connect with the community, the kids can connect with local schools, and people can get on with their lives. And that's a really important benefit. We have a changing housing market. Part of that is people being forced into the rental market because there's less options for people to buy, and it's really important that one component of that rental market is a thriving social housing and affordable housing system.
So let's begin this segment with you, Danny Addison. When we look at why there's such a lack of social and affordable housing, the blame is often placed at the feet of developers who seek to lower the proportion of such housing in their developments and to contribute less to shared facilities like roads and public open spaces. Is there an element of truth in that?
Oh, there's a limited element of truth in that, but I question the basis for the argument. I mean, the development industry definitely contributes its fair share in terms of community amenities and services and the rest. When it comes to social and affordable housing, this is definitely a new area where the development industry has realised that there's a number of things it can do, and the conversation around where it can have impact has changed, especially here in Victoria. The state government's announced its social housing growth fund, which is a really really a partnership opportunity for the development industry and the community housing sector to work together with the government to deliver more stock. So there are partnership approaches which are the way to go, and then there's blunt planning tools which often simply remove the ability to have a conversation and also the appetite to invest where those blunt tools are employed.
Rebecca Huntley, how do people feel about affordable housing, particularly when it's in their own backyard?
Look, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what affordable housing is, community housing, public housing, and there is some stigma. And there's lots of academic work being done on, what the community might feel before some affordable housing comes in and how they might feel afterwards. What is absolutely clear is that Australians recognise that renting, whether you have money or not, but the mere fact you are renting is a mug's game. It's very, very hard to live a stable life when you are a renter. Choice did a really interesting piece of research about this, found that 50% of the people that they surveyed were in fear of being blacklisted by agents. A good percentage of those people didn't complain about rental accommodation, even if there were problems, because they were scared of the ramifications. 75% of the people that were surveyed said that they felt it was incredibly competitive and that they needed to offer, 2-3 months bond, that, there were lots of haggling. And so if you don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of bargaining power in the rental market at the moment, it is really very difficult.
Stephen Koukoulas, when we talk about housing affordability, one of the arguments that's often made is that if you put more houses on the market, you build supply, you take the whole problem away. How accurate is that?
I think it's remarkably accurate. The economics that I learned at university all those years ago still works out. Supply and demand do have an impact, and one of the problems, of course, be it social housing, public housing or private sector housing, is that we just haven't built enough places. That every 3 years Australia's population increases by more than 1 million people. Now, a lot of those people live in the big cities, and so we've got to be building a large number of places year in, year out to just house them, just to keep supply constant. So that's got to be across the spectrum as well, not just expensive freestanding dwellings, but also apartments, but also, as we're just seeing here in that clip, about affordable social housing. And I think that's the thing that's been missing in the debate in recent times, is the absence of public sector housing. In fact, if you look at the number of public sector house building approvals over the last couple of years, they've fallen to the lowest levels ever. We haven't had the government sector, state or federal, building public sector housing, and that is arguably creating part of the problem at the lower end of the spectrum, as people who would otherwise have been eligible for this low-cost housing are being forced into the private market and pushing up demand for the rental market in that space.
John Hewson, we put out a call out to our viewers online to tell us about what they think about the state of the housing market, and one of the recurring themes has been that being able to buy a home or being able to rent somewhere decent at an affordable price is a basic human right. Is that a reasonable expectation?
I think it is. It always has been in this country. I think people, had a great passion in the early post-war years for the quarter-acre block, their own home on a small block. And there were good government programs in those days, by the way, to facilitate that process. I think of the way Canberra was populated, for example, with the housing schemes, and houses were made available either on a rent or buy basis. Many thousands, tens of thousands of people were able to get into housing in various ways. In the end, they actually, in most cases, have bought those houses. They've now probably gone through another generation, been renovated and so on. And I think that's become an expectation of our way of life in this country. And to see the circumstances today where a whole generation of young people seem to be locked out of the market, at least in Sydney and Melbourne, the way things stand and the way they look like going in the future, I think it's a reasonable expectation.
Now, we've been looking at what the federal government could do to help some buyers. What about the states? One option is abolishing stamp duty altogether, maybe to be replaced by a broad-based land tax. Victoria hasn't gone that far, but it has made some changes to help people enter the housing market. Take a look.
The state government initiative is to remove stamp duty for first home buyers for purchases under $600,000. The other initiative is going to be a tiered concessional stamp duty for people that buy up to $750,000. The positive is for people looking to buy into regional areas where the median house price is already less than $600,000. But I think what it is going to do, it is going to put further demand into already a very strong market in Victoria. If a property is vacant for more than 6 months, there will be a 1% tax that will be levied on the capital value of that property. I understand that utility companies will be involved, so if the lights aren't on, that's probably a sign that the property is vacant.
So, Rebecca, can I come to you about this? Stamp duty is often described as the killer blow when you're buying a property, that, extra however many thousand on top of the purchase price. Yeah. So is this a good idea?
Look, I think that you do hear people talk a lot about the anxiety around stamp duty. You also, one area where I hear it talked about a lot is older Australians looking for reasons not to leave their, big family home to downsize, and so that's often one of the issues that you have. Certainly the quality of research I've shown is that people are of a certain generation are staying in these larger houses for longer, mainly because they can't find the kind of housing stock that they want, but then they also think about selling the house and then, what that's going to take. So I think it does. It's on top of everything else. It's about people seeing those big dollars, and it's the deposit, it's the stamp duty, it's not just the mortgage payments, and that's definitely what you hear as well from younger Australians. If they're not lucky to get their parents to hand over a wad of cash, or Auntie Edna dies and they get a little bit of money from them, there are all these big lumps, not just about servicing the mortgage, but all those big lumps you really need up front. Now, if you're already paying quite a lot in rent and in cost of living, and you've got wage restraint, which a lot of people talk about, this idea that real wages aren't increasing. If you live in the city, it becomes really difficult.
John, stamp duty is such a huge income generator for the states. How does the federal government sell this idea to the states?
Well, I think you can look at this at two levels. I mean, I think basically to abolish stamp duty or reduce stamp duty is to the benefit of the vendor in most cases. They just put the price up. The developers put the price up, take advantage of it. So you don't make any net gain. But in terms of the broader issue of tax reform, I think if we can move away completely from stamp duties towards a broad-based land tax, I think that's the way to go. But of course, land is basically a state responsibility in this country. You really need it to be a national initiative. So it's been tried in the ACT, but I don't think anyone else is rushing into it, which is a pity.
They try everything in the ACT.
Yeah, that's right. Stephen Koukoulas, how much do unoccupied homes feed into the equations of inequality and, this argument that foreign investors are driving up prices and immigration is driving up prices?
Oh, there's no doubt that it is a fundamental driver that we're talking about, again, supply and demand. I hate to keep harping on that point, but if we've got this unrelenting demand coming through, high immigration levels, well, that's an important underpinning of demand and the price level. But also we've got to ensure that we do have foreign investors who are leaving the properties empty in some instances, to ensure that that new supply of dwellings is actually put into use, that it's either being lived in by someone or rented out to someone. If the properties that we're seeing are built or a significant number of them are left vacant, then of course we're not really adding to the supply of housing, which doesn't alleviate the rental concerns, nor does it alleviate the price concerns. So a combination of making sure that the foreign investment flows into the country are well managed and well regulated, but also to make sure that the properties, once they've been bought by someone, domestic as well as foreign, that they're actually rented out and hitting the market is an important part of addressing the supply. So the vacancy tax, yeah, it's going to be a lot of red tape and a lot of administration where each property is going to have a look at their electricity bill and their water usage and all this other stuff just to collect a few dollars. I don't know whether it's that efficient in that sense. There's a lot of red tape, as I mentioned, but if it encourages people to put their property onto the rental market rather than just leaving it vacant, well, then I guess that helps at the margin.
So let's take a look at another idea being trialled in Victoria. That's shared equity. If you tick all the boxes for a mortgage but don't have the money, you can enter a partnership with a state or private lender to buy a house.
A shared equity scheme is a scheme whereby a private lender or the government goes into partnership with a home buyer to purchase a home and shares in any gains or any losses when that property is eventually sold. It enables a home buyer to enter the property market by only paying, say, 75%, whereas the co-buyer will pay the others 25%. And therefore it makes the home more accessible to the first home buyer who doesn't qualify for a traditional mortgage. The Western Australian scheme, which is named Keystart, has been operating for several years, and it has been quite successful in boosting first home buyer numbers in that state. For example, Western Australia's first home buyer share is significantly greater than the other states of Australia. Victoria last week introduced a shared equity scheme of its own, which is a pilot program targeted at 400 buyers. The problem is, Melbourne's property is already sky high. We have one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. And you cannot solve an affordability problem by sucking more buyers into the net and more credit into the system. And the Victorian government's initiative risks raising demand and further inflating prices, which will be self-defeating from an affordability perspective.
Now, Danny Addison, you've been seeing this program approaching in Victoria. Tell me, what do you think the take-up is going to be and what the impact is likely to be?
Jeremy, the impact of this pilot program is going to be small. I believe they're looking at about 100 homes in the first round. What is going to have more of an impact, and as I mentioned before, the unintended consequences, are the impact on the rental market from the state government's changes to stamp duties. They've moved all stamp duty concessions to first home buyers and removed all stamp duty concessions for any investors, which is going to push rental prices up. So there are a number of great pilot initiatives, a number of great partner initiatives, but what we're talking to the Victorian Treasurer about and to the Federal Treasurer about are the unintended consequences that any changes to the taxation regime can have on the investment sector.
Rebecca Huntley, does shared equity have the same appeal to a home buyer as buying a home outright?
Oh, look, if it's a difference between not being in your own home and staying out of the market, then yeah. And look, I think I can understand the appeal for this because in all the qualitative research I've done, it's very rare to meet somebody on an average income who's been able to get into the housing market, particularly in very competitive markets where they haven't had some parental support. If you don't have parental support, or somebody, even if you're just camping in your parents' lounge room for 2 years while you kind of get the deposit together, it's really, really hard. But I think Danny makes a really interesting point. I think one thing the electorate do know is that if you have all these atomised policies and not a big plan that you're selling to the electorate about how to deal with this huge issue, you can have kind of countervailing forces and things don't work well together. The First Homeowners Grant, perfect example of that.
John Hewson, whatever the solution, is it possible to create a useful and significant injection of housing into the market without sending prices south?
It's going to be very difficult to manage. I mean, realistically, it's not something you can change overnight. You're going to have to phase it in over time. And you can't go too far too fast in some of these areas, because if you really do hit house prices hard, for example, you can burst the bubble. and bust the bubble, I should say, and cause a very significant problem as the herd, people get on it and they pull out of the housing market and have quite a crisis. So it needs to be carefully managed. It needs an integrated strategy that extends over a period of years, that people can see that if implemented over time, you can actually satisfy the demand, the rising demand, at the same time you're dealing with some of the supply constraints that really make it very hard to do that right now.
Stephen Koukoulas, very briefly, you're nodding your head there in agreement. And tell me, what do you think of John's argument there?
Look, I think it's really fundamental that we've got to have a look at a range of policies that add to supply, whichever way that can be done at the state, local level, and that takes some of the heat out of demand. So the shared ownership scheme is dreadful policy. We don't need another injection of demand from the government helping people to buy their house. We've got to ensure that we have plenty of supply, cut unnecessary demand, and that will in time hopefully deflate the bubble slowly without causing a crash.
And that is all for Lateline and our housing special. Thanks to our panel, John Hewson, Rebecca Huntley, Stephen Koukoulas, Danny Addison. Thank you all for joining us. And those stories explaining the different measures to promote housing affordability were produced by Hamish Fitzsimmons and Carrington Clark.